Richard Thomson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to begin by echoing some of the comments made by the Right Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland about how disappointing I find it that there aren't more contributors from the government benches on this, and that they resemble more like the decks of the Marie Celeste than a parliament on a day when we're debating something of such import, notwithstanding the excellent contributions in their own way made by the member for Weston-super-Mare and for the member for Devizes. I also enjoyed very much the contribution that was made by the Right Honourable Member for Derby South. Her scepticism towards a written constitution disappointed me, but didn't surprise me. There are many big-ticket constitutional items that this place could benefit from, such as seeing us elected here under a proportional voting system, having a written constitution, a Bill of Rights and an independent constitutional court beyond the scope of ministerial interference. Those are just the standard trappings of modern liberal democracies, but I've long since given up any hope of that coming into effect in this place, which is one of the reasons why I think it would be better for Scotland to make a fresh start where a consensus for such measures, I believe, exists. But even with, Mr Deputy Speaker, those big-ticket reforms, we still need codes, standards, norms, conventions, and how individuals and groups operate within that framework. In her opening remarks, the Honourable Member for Ashton-under-Lyne referenced Professor Peter Hennessy and his good chap theory of government, which in putting that forward, he emphasised the courtesies, the conventions, the orthodoxies that are taken for granted, which means that the situation that Lord Hailsham described many years ago of government being like an elected dictatorship never actually comes to pass, and that the individual excesses of ministers or prime ministers or overmighty and overreaching executives can be curbed and corrected, rather than having anyone or anything slithering in between the gaps that exist and exhausting all reserves of trust and goodwill, and they're no longer deserving of either. So in those spaces, standards matter. I think that any perception to the contrary that is allowed to build up is something which damages politics in general, but damages us all. It diminishes the legitimacy of the decisions that we take. It deters good people from getting involved in public life. But most damaging of all, it pushes people away from having the chance to express their views democratically by participating at the ballot box. Now, we've heard in several contributions so far the continuing reverberations of Partygate, and certainly in a debate on standards, that provides a target-rich environment. But even prior to that, Mr Deputy Speaker, there was no shortages of areas of concern. One, to pick an example, quite notoriously, when the Prime Minister's ethics advisor found that the Home Secretary had breached the ministerial code governing ministers' behaviour, the only consequence that flowed from that was that the Prime Minister's advisor ended up having to resign while the Home Secretary remained in office. And while a court found that the Prime Minister had not misapplied the ministerial code, and whatever people might think about that, legally that was probably quite a sound decision. It was a sound decision simply because of the nature of the way that the code works at the moment, where the Prime Minister retains complete control over all references, including any references in the code relating to himself. Now, a standards system can only operate with as much integrity as those who are charged with implementing it have themselves. And we have a Prime Minister who is not only the gatekeeper to that process, he's also effectively the judge, the jury, and if need be the executioner, and remains so despite his manifest unsuitability, in my view, for him to carry out that role, and also despite the very, very clear recommendations of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which are referenced in the motion before us today. Now, I accept that there has been a fresh iteration, as the Paymaster General says, of the Ministerial Code and how it applies. And At a time when the public focus on standards has never been higher, it's very disappointing that the Prime Minister and the Government has decided to pick and choose, once again, what suits them and what doesn't. I think it's telling that the 7 Nolan principles were removed from the introduction to the Government's guide, effectively disassociating the Prime Minister personally in word from that which he'd already quite spectacularly disassociated himself in deed in terms of his time in office. But if the problems are clear, so too are the solutions, or at least some of them. I think that it was illustrated graphically in stark numerical terms yesterday that the Prime Minister has lost a considerable amount of authority within his party. That's an authority which he'd already lost in the electorate at large a long time ago. I'm bound to observe that in Scotland the Prime Minister can now only rely on the support of 2 out of 59 members of Parliament, although it is another day on from yesterday, and who knows what position the honourable member for Murray has contorted himself into since then. But although sadly the Prime Minister is not about to be run out of office in the next 2 hours, whether it's in the next 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, most assuredly the Prime Minister will be gone and meriting his own rather inglorious set of footnotes in history. So this is about the standards framework that we have going forward, and we shouldn't twist it or distort it to suit the present incumbent, but we should be mindful of examples of his behaviour in order to make the code and its operation as watertight as it ever can be. Now, I challenged the Paymaster General. He was good enough to take my intervention about whether or not the Government would implement all the recommendations, as he indicated when he said he was supportive of the principles. And I have to say I remain baffled how the Government can be in support of the principles of the motion while recommending their members abstain and still saying that they will not support all of the implementation of the measures in full. Now, I don't think, in closing my remarks, Mr Deputy Speaker, that there's anything that can be done that can restore the reputation of this Prime Minister or the administration that he leads. But what is needed urgently is to rebuild trust, and that is to reaffirm immediately and without qualification the 7 principles of public life, those of selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty and leadership. But also it is to implement, without repetition, deviation or hesitation, each and every one of the recommendations in the report as the motion before us calls for.
Justin Matters.